In this lecture, I'm going to show you how to do input validation. So as a security best practice, you should never, ever trust what the client sends you. You should always validate the input. So in this particular example, because we're dealing with a simple object with only one property, that is name, we can write some validation logic like this. So if request.body.name doesn't exist, or request.body.name.length is less than 3, then we're going to return an error to the client. The RESTful convention is to return a response with the HTTP status code of 400. That means bad request. So to do this, we call response.status 400, and then we can send an error message. In this case, we can write a generic error message like name is required and should be minimum 3 characters. Now in your implementation, you may want to differentiate the errors. For example, if the client didn't send the name property, perhaps you would just respond with name is required. Or if they did send the name, but the name was not long enough, you could send a different error message. And then finally, we return here because we don't want the rest of this function to be executed. So this is the basic idea. However, in a real-world application, it's more likely that you will be working with a complex object, something more complex than this course object here. You don't want to write a complex validation logic like this at the beginning of your route handler. So let me introduce you to a Node package that makes it really easy for you to validate the input. So on Google, if you search for npm joy with I, look, here's the first link. So here you can see Joy has been downloaded over 250,000 times over the past day and over 3 million times over the past month. It's a very popular package. Also here on this page, you can see some sample code and link to their official documentation. Now let me show you how to replace this validation logic with Joy. So first, back in the terminal, let's install Joy. So you can see at the time of recording this video, the latest version is version 13.1.0. If you want to make sure that you have the exact same experience as what I'm going to show you in this video, then install this exact version. So npm install joy at 13.1.0. Okay. Now back in the code, on the top, we need to load this module. So require joy, get the result and store it in a constant called joy with a capital J. Because what is returned from this module is a class. And as I told you before, in JavaScript, we use Pascal naming convention to name our classes. So the first letter of every word should be uppercase. Also, as a best practice, put all your required calls on top of the file. This way you can easily see what are the dependencies of this module. So this module, index module, is dependent upon 2 modules. One is joy, the other is express. Okay, so we have this joy class. Now back in our route handler. Now with joy, first we need to define a schema. A schema defines the shape of our objects. What properties do we have in that object? What is the type of each property? Do we have an email? Do we have a string? What are the minimum or maximum number of characters? Do we have a number? What range should that number be in? So this is the job of a schema. So here, first I'm going to define a schema. Constant schema. We set it to an object. This is the shape of our course object. So here we want to have a name property, and we set this to joy.string. So we're telling Joy that this is a string, and it should have minimum 3 characters, and it should be required. So it has a very fluent API. Again, you can look at the documentation to see all the methods that are available to you. So here's our schema. Now we call joy.validate, and we give it request.body as well as our schema. Now this validate method returns an object. Let's store that in a constant called result. For this demo, I'm going to log this result on the console. So before we go any further, let's save this. Go back to the Postman. Let's create another course. Now back in the terminal. So this is our result object. It has two properties, error and value. Only one of these can have a value. So in this case, because we sent a valid course object, we have that object here as the value of the value property. And you can see error is null. If we send an invalid object, value will be null and error will be set. Let me show you. So back in Postman, let's remove the name property, send. Now back in the terminal. Okay, look. So here's the result object. This is the error property. It's set to an object that has validation error. Child name fails because name is required. So back to our route handler. Instead of this manual validation logic, we can check the value of result.error property. So if result.error, then we're going to send a response with status code of 400. And in the body of the response, for now, we can simply add result.error. Okay? And we don't need this console.log anymore. Save. Now back in Postman, one more time, I'm going to send this empty object. Now look at the response. So this is what we get. An object with these properties is joy, name, details, which is an array of error messages. So here's the first message, name is required. Now this object is too complex to send to the client. Perhaps you want to simplify this. So back in the code, one simple solution is to go to the details array, get the first element, and then access the message property. Or instead of using the first element, you may want to access all elements in this array, get their message property, and concatenate them. That's entirely up to you. So save. One more time. Let's send an invalid request. And now we get name is required. If we go to our request and add the name property, but set it to a string that is only one character, now we get a different error. Name length must be at least 3 characters long. So you can see Joy makes it really easy to validate the input and return proper error messages to the client.